Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Pilgrim Song, episode 9. We have yet another guest, my buddy Clay Miller, goes to church with me. And of course, I'm Alexander. Been hosting here for a little bit, so we're glad to be back, and we're going to have a pretty good discussion today. So, Clay, give us a little bit of your background.
Yeah, so I'm a sophomore here at the University of Alabama. I grew up in Florence, Alabama, which is at the northern part of the state. And I've grown up in the church my entire life. I was raised by a very good family. All of us were Christians, and I was very fortunate to have that, I think, because at a very young age, I was shown the importance of the gospel and knowing why, I needed to become a Christian myself. And so as far as being converted, I didn't necessarily have, a struggle for myself to find it. But I will say that because I grew up in a family where we were all Christians, I went to a small church where it was very peaceful. There was a lot of harmony. And so everything was kind of just, done for me. I never really had to answer a lot of questions for myself. Not to say that was a bad thing, because it's good that we didn't have a lot of problems. But I will say, I guess the one thing about me is that realizing coming to college is that you really have to have your own faith. You have to start answering your own questions, which is why I'm glad you're doing podcasts like this. And as you know, I've talked about how wanting to do something like this myself. I love speaking and thinking for myself. Yeah. And I think that is crucial as a Christian. And not to spoil the topic today, but spiritually, that's the one thing that you can really be greedy about. You can never have enough knowledge. And that's what I'm thankful for, that I came to Alabama and where I wasn't around my family, because I really had to start asking myself some questions about what it means to be a Christian and what it means to think for myself on specific issues. And so, I'm glad I was able to meet people like you, and I'm glad I'm able to try to, have my own thoughts now about these, important topics.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad I met you too. Yeah. But that's a really good thing for you to mention. That was important for me going off to college and realizing that you can't live attached to your parents' faith or your whatever church's faith. You have to come to know Jesus for yourself. So that's a really important aspect. Right. Thank you for telling us about that. Yeah. So I put in here, this is just fun fact information. So do you have a favorite scripture?
Yeah, so we actually talked about this not long ago in one of David's lessons, but my favorite scripture has always been 2 Timothy 4:7-8, when Paul is nearing the end of his life, and he's talking about, he's fought the good fight, he's finished the race, and now there's a crown of righteousness laid up for him. And I think that's just beautiful, because he's telling, the Timothy there that, this life is not all there is. There's a point to it. It's a race, and when you finish it, that's when you have your reward. And that's what I'm just trying to do now as a Christian, and what I hope we're all trying to do.
Yeah, that's a great verse. And we went to a funeral today to remember one of our brothers and that was on his flyer, was that verse, and that's really important. That's really poignant for us. So continuing that fight, really good one. And do you have a favorite hymn?
Yeah, so my favorite song is Over the Sunset Sea. I think I've told you that before, but it's an older song that it's not really sung that much, but it's a song about heaven again. But I think we've talked about this. It's just a beautiful song talking about, nature and kind of, how seeing that in our earth and seeing the sunset and knowing how, just like that, our life one day will come to a close when we go to meet, our Creator. And I think I just really like that song because of that.
Okay. I haven't sung that one, so you'll have to lead it for us for sure. I'm going to head right into and start talking about a little bit about our subject this morning. So I have a long list of podcast ideas, and I pitched a lot of those to you. So when you kind of put this in your top 3, what we're going to be talking about is something I got out of a movie. And it's not about you. So when you got that, and when you were like, this is the one I want to do, or one of the ones I want to do, what were you thinking?
So I really I love that topic. I'm glad you picked it, and that's why I put it first. But when I saw it, I thought about kind of selfishness. That idea that today we live in a world where it seems to be instant gratification for myself, and it's how can I advance myself in the world. How can I make myself look good? And really thinking about it, that's good from a worldly standpoint. But, what I hoped we were going to talk about is as Christians, that is the furthest mindset we should have. That it is not about ourselves, because, Christ, if he would have lived like that, then we would have no hope.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a really good point. So when I had this, it was originally going to be a sermon. I had an idea for a sermon, but then I realized like I'm teaching some older folks, and I got it from a Marvel movie, so I figured that probably won't be the best. But if you've seen Doctor Strange, that came out in 2016, there's a moment where his mentor, the Ancient One, is dying, and there's this really beautiful moment where the rain is falling and the lightning is coming and all this stuff. And she's talking to him about how he has progressed so much as the Sorcerer Supreme, and he's so brilliant, all this stuff. But then she's like, you've forgotten like the most important aspect, what stopped you from being great, essentially. And he asks her like, what is the deal? And her response is, it's not about you. And I think that was a really thing to put in a Marvel movie. I doubt they mean it the way that we're going to be talking about it today, but that line has just stuck with me continually. And it's like, what an impactful statement to make to everyone watching is, we are such, as Clay was mentioning, we are such a selfish people and such a selfish culture. We need to be constantly meditating on this idea that it's not about us. And we're going to have a specific way of thinking about this because we're Christians.
Right.
So,
right.
So from your perspective, why do you think that selfishness is such a big part of our culture?
Yeah. So, well, first of all, and this one is going to sound silly, but I think as humans, it's almost natural to be selfish, right? Mm-hmm. Because, and this is going to sound stupid, but we're the only ones living our life, right? Mm. Your thoughts are the only thoughts running through your head. Like, I don't have your thoughts in my head. So whenever you want something, that's all you hear. That's all you want. And so we only think about ourselves, and it can be hard just naturally to, think about what other people want. And so when all you think about is your own desires, that's number one. But obviously that doesn't mean we can just give into it.
Yeah.
But I think honestly, the biggest two reasons why selfishness is so prevalent is because, number one, it's comfortable. It's easy to think about yourself. And you see that, whether in the Bible, whether in the world, it's so easy to just be like, well, I want to do this, so I'm going to do it. Mm-hmm. And you don't have to necessarily put other people's, wants ahead of your own and make that sacrifice.
Yeah.
And, there's a saying that, sin is comfortable a lot of times. And so the devil knows that we like comfortable. Yeah. And selfishness is the easiest way to get us to that is, well, if I don't have to do something for somebody else and all I got to do is worry about myself, that's easy, And so because of that, it's just so easy to say, well, you take care of yourself, I'll take care of myself, and let's just live our lives. Yeah. And it's comfortable. And I think that, the second thing is that we all like to be, put on a pedestal, right? We all like to be seen as good people and as being the best at whatever we do. And I think this one is really the temptation for us as Christians. And I would say this topic is very prevalent even in religious circles to be selfish. Yeah. Because, think about it. We look at ourselves as Christians as being, good servants of the word and good people. And because of that, we can kind of begin to think that, well, we're better than the rest of the world, right? And so therefore it's, well, what can they tell me how good I am? Let me show everybody how good I am. And that selfish attitude that if we're not careful, we begin to do things for ourselves instead of for other people. But at the end of the day, in the world, and whether you're in a religion or not, it's because you want that praise. Yeah. We much rather be seen as someone who is, good and perfect than someone who is belittled. And it comes down to it. Pride is the issue. Yeah. Pride is the root of selfishness.
For sure.
Yeah.
I had not even thought about it from that perspective, but like 24 hours a day, the thoughts I have in my head are mine alone. So that's, of course, what I'm going to be thinking about most naturally. So that's a really good point. I hadn't thought of it that way before. Yeah. But yeah, there's just so much about our culture that is really pushing on this idea that you need to go do you, and you need to go get yours, and you live your truth and all that type of thing. But if you take that to the most extreme level, you do so much damage to the people around you. Like, when I was writing the script, like trying to put something together for it, I was like, yeah, drunk driving is one of the most selfish things you could possibly do. But texting and driving is just as selfish.
Yeah. And
people get harmed from that as well. So those things that we see as not a big deal, and confession time. I do that more than I should, but like, and I need to stop. But that's a reality, is that we are so much more selfish than we like to think.
Yeah.
And that's why talking about pride and really trying to come at it is a hard thing. It's something we all struggle with.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, and I think you also made a really good point about in being in a religious circle, and we're called to be a holy people. We're called to be separate and called to act different. So then when we do act different and we act more like Jesus, that does make us better, but that we can't forget where we come from, and that we still fall short continually. So I think that's a really good aspect too.
No, I agree. And I think it's just important to realize that being selfish and being, a person that is always trying to see how they can benefit themselves, in the end, that doesn't really get you, what you want. Mm-hmm. I mean, because if you always are thinking about yourself, then you're never really going to have truly people who care about you. And people will say, or maybe ask the question, well, what does it benefit me if I'm trying to help other people? What are they going to do for me? I'm just doing something nice for them and getting nothing in return. But really, you shouldn't expect anything in return. Mm-hmm. And, it is frustrating sometimes if the whole world only thought about themselves, how would we be able to be a good, human race, right? We'd all just be, selfish individuals. And so we need that humility, that ability to work with one another. And you've seen time and time throughout history, when people do put aside their selfishness to help each other, that's when actually good things happen. So I think that's a good thing to remember, is that, there may be some things in my life that I really want to do and that are selfish. And maybe I should think about other people. And by helping them, I end up helping myself. Yeah. And, that's something that's hard to see when you're actually in whatever situation. But a lot of times the blessings and the benefits come from helping somebody else are a lot greater than just thinking about yourself only.
Yeah. So I think that's an awesome point as well. The idea of just imagining a society where everyone is simply self-interested all the time, it would be a disaster. So yeah, it's a tragic thing, but a lot of times we fall into this, us as Christians and just people in general fall into this trap of being prideful. And that's what we're going to be discussing. And hopefully as we talk through this, and we're going to hop into some scripture, hopefully as we come through this, it'll help you and encourage you to be more humble and see God and rely on his grace. So, anything else you have before we head into it?
No, thank you. That's all I got.
All right, cool. So we are back, and we're going to talk about a story out of 2 Kings chapter 5. So, Clay, when you think about a selfish figure in the Bible, who's like your default if you were to come up with one?
Selfish person in the Bible.
Yeah.
I don't know. Honestly, I think of Jonah right away. Mm-hmm. Like he's the first thought, because just, you see it in his actions. He's doing whatever it takes to get away from what God has asked him to do. Yeah. But, I mean, I don't know. I haven't really thought about that, actually. But Jonah would definitely be my first one.
Okay. Yeah, that's a really good example. Yeah. Mine probably would be Ahab, but I already used Ahab on this podcast. So I thought of my other one, who comes out of Kings as well.
Or Simon the Sorcerer. I would say
Simon the Sorcerer is really good, too. Yeah. So mine comes out of 2 Kings chapter 5, and is a combination of Naaman and Gehazi. I think these characters are very interesting for us to study, and that's what we're going to be talking about. So Clay and I are going to be discussing it. And if you want to read along with us, I'm going to start in chapter 5, verse 1. It says, Naaman, commander of the army of the king of Syria, was a great man with his master, and in high favor because by him the Lord had given victory to Syria. He was a mighty man of valor, but he was a leper. Now the Syrians on one of their raids had carried off a little girl from the land of Israel, and she worked in the service of Naaman's wife. She said to her mistress, "Would that my lord were with the prophet who was in Samaria. He would cure him of his leprosy." So Naaman went in and told his lord. Thus and so spoke the girl from the land of Israel. And the king of Syria said, "Go now, I will send a letter to the king of Israel." So he went, taking with him the 10 talents of
silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, and 10 changes of clothing. And he brought the letter to the king of Israel, which read, "When this letter reaches you, know that I have sent you to Naaman, my servant, that you may cure him of his leprosy." And when the king of Israel read the letter, he tore his clothes and said, "Am I a God to kill and to make alive? This man sends word to me to cure a man of his leprosy? Only consider and see how he is seeking a quarrel with me." But when Elisha, the man of God, heard the king of Israel had torn his clothes, he sent to the king, saying, "Why have you torn your clothes? Let him now come to me, that he may know that there is a prophet in Israel." So Naaman came with his horses and chariots and stood at the door of Elisha's house. And Elisha sent a messenger to him, saying, "Go and wash in the Jordan 7 times, and your flesh shall be restored, and you shall be clean." But Naaman was angry and went away, saying, "Behold, I thought that he would surely come out to me, and stand and call upon the name of the Lord his God, and wave his hand over the place, and cure the leper. Are not Abana and Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than the waters of Israel? Could I not wash in them and be clean?" So he turned and went away in a rage. But his servants came near and said to him, "My father, it is a great word the prophet has spoken to you. Will you not do it? Has he actually said to you, 'Wash and be clean'?" So he went down and dipped himself 7 times in the Jordan, according to the word of the man of God, and his flesh was restored like the flesh of a little child, and he was clean.
So, opening up the story, we're introduced to Naaman, who is a Syrian, high up. He is the commander of this army, and it says specifically that God had given victory in Syria to this man specifically. But the negative is he's a leper. And leprosy in the Old Testament, it encompassed a lot of different flesh diseases, so we don't know exactly what it means, but whatever it was, it's probably pretty gross. It probably caused a lot of pain, and it was something he was going to be struggling with. And particularly, you come into Israel, you're unclean if you're a leper, so you have to stay away from the populace. So a really dangerous position for him. But our first selfless character we see in this is a little servant girl from Israel. So Syria goes on a raid into Israel, takes this girl out, and her attitude could have been, "I hate the Syrians. I hate Naaman for taking me here. I hate him for being my master," all this type of stuff. But instead, she hopes that he is able to go, or basically, I wished he was in Samaria so that Elisha could help him. And I think that shows a ton of humility, because it would be our instinct that this guy took me away from my family. He deserves to die, and I hope he suffers a long time with this leprosy. But that's not her attitude. So that's at the beginning of the story, we see this really incredible, faithful little girl here and from Israel. So I really enjoy that little aspect of the opening. Do you have anything to say on that?
I mean, like you said, I think this is just a great lesson in humility towards even people that you may not like or your enemies. Yeah. Because you mentioned, she would have known leprosy, I think, in Israel, and known how terrible that was to have it. So not only is her master a Syrian who has taken her captive and, is making her his servant, but he's also a leper now. And instead of being bitter toward him and seeing him as oh, he has leprosy too, well, that even makes him even more of a terrible person. Yeah. She asked the question, that he would be near the prophet Elisha so that he could heal him. And that's just a great lesson and towards us, because Jesus talks about this in the Sermon on the Mount, but it has been said that you should hate your enemies, but I say love your enemies. Yeah. Here, this little girl is showing that even back then towards someone who she should have hated. Yeah. And just a great lesson to us that there may be people that you don't like, but that does not mean that you should not do your absolute best to show Christ through you. Because you don't know the example and the impact that you can have on them. And we'll see, as we saw reading it, it ends up turning his life around because of her impact.
Yeah. And as you were mentioning, this is a sin that's extremely easy to be comfortable with. Yeah. It would be so easy for her to just hate him because that is what her natural inclination is. But she decides instead to serve. And that's going to be, as Clay was mentioning, that's going to be our call to imitate Christ and to serve those who, even the ones that don't like us. So. But yeah, so what happens is Naaman it's got told to his wife, so she tells him, and he asks basically for some permission from the king of Syria, gets some nice gifts together, lots of silver and gold, as well as clothing, which I guess I can see the benefit in that, but it's definitely different in Old Testament context where clothing was for me, I just think like Old Navy, you can get stuff for $6. So it's different for us for sure. But this is a rich offering to bring to somebody. So he brings this letter with him as well, and he brings it to the king of Israel. And the king of Israel is my first example of a selfish character in this story, because only an absurd man would receive this letter, know he has zero divine power, and then think, it's my job to cure this leper. It makes no sense. Like, I don't think he was thinking with his brain. Like, I didn't, as much as I try to read through this and I'm like, what is he trying to say? I don't know. But he genuinely believes, like, he asked the question, am I a God to do this? And it's like, of course not. Why did you make this so much about you? It doesn't say specifically which king this is either. I think that's interesting. But he's very much thinking, okay, this guy is trying to get him to cure his leprosy. This must mean he means war. It just, like, the leaps and bounds that he takes out of this, kind of, again, showing the selfishness of the general Israelite population, just a microcosm of their king and how that reflects on the rest of Israel at this point. Because the period of the kings is just horrendous in a lot of ways. Right. So, anything you guys say on that?
Well,
that part?
Yeah, just reading the story, you realize like how much wickedness is in this story, besides Elisha and the servant girl, because you have all these. You have Naaman, who at the beginning of our story is not the greatest of a guy. No. And then you have this king, as you talked about, is not a good guy. And the fact that he thinks that, that this letter is to him, that he's supposed to cure him is insane. But, you just see as this story progresses that even in a broken world at this time, in a broken situation, you're going to see good come out of it. And, as we see here, Elisha now is going to intervene in the situation.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. We've come through some pretty dark times over the past year, so it's important to know, there is still light out there, and you should be one trying to be the light. So, right. But yeah. So as we come through, the king tears his clothes. Elisha hears about this, gets a message to him, like, what is your deal, basically? So redirects Naaman back towards Elisha's house. And Elisha, he could have done he could have healed this guy in any way he wanted to. He could have come out with like a magic robe on and like, I don't know. He could have done a bunch of whatever he wanted to do. But instead, what he decides to do is go use a messenger, not even himself. Use a messenger to go and tell Naaman, go dip 7 times in the Jordan, you'll be clean. And I don't know, maybe it's my bias in this story, but I think that's a really humble thing to do, because Elisha could have used any method he wanted to. He could have come out in front of him. He could have accepted the gifts, like, I want the gifts first, or any of that stuff. But he chooses not even to show his face to Naaman. So I think that illustrates just the humility of the type of person that Elisha was.
Right. And we talked about how Naaman was an important member of the Syrian army. And Elisha is not embarrassing him here. He could have made this, the prophet of Israel is healing this man of Syria. But no, his message is very simple. And we're about to see Naaman's reaction, of course. But to me, that's just a beautiful thing. And that applies to everything that God asked us to do, is that in reality, it's very simple. You don't have to make it something it's not. Elijah literally just sends a messenger to him, tells him what to do, and that's it. And now it's up to Naaman to react to that. And, the same is true for us. A lot of times I think we make things that God tells us a lot more difficult than they actually are, Absolutely. And we try to, like, Naaman gets mad because, he wanted more of a spectacle. And sometimes as Christians, we want to create more of a spectacle, when in the end, just doing what we're told to do is going to have much more of an effect.
Yeah. And God really works in these really just subtle ways a lot of times. So for sure, that's a really good point. But as Clay was mentioning, he hears this message to dip 7 times in the Jordan, and Naaman's reaction is, okay, what in the world? Like, he should have come out and talked to me. He could have held his hand out and cured the leper. He could have called out to his God, done all this type of stuff. Or the stupid Jordan, like, that's the dumbest river on the planet. Why could I not go home to Damascus? There's better rivers out there. Like, what kind of ridiculous prophet is this? What kind of mad prophet is this? And I just,
for the end of verse 12, like after it comes out of this quotation, it says, so he turned and went away in a rage. This man tells you this harmful, like hurtful disease. All you got to do is wash 7 times in a river and you're good. And his reaction is to turn away in rage. Like, it blows my mind, but
I don't understand their reaction here at all. This is so crazy to me because, we don't know how long exactly. I don't think it says how long Naaman's been living with this disease, but literally someone comes and tells him all you gotta do is go wash in a river 7 times and you're clean. And I'd be like running to the river.
Exactly.
And instead Naaman is mad because of where it is or that Elisha didn't come talk to him. And I just think it's so funny because, like, the names of the rivers, Abana and Pharpar, there's not even good river names. Like, I just think that whole statement there is so funny to me. But looking on from the outside, we see how stupid it is. And even his servants, say, look, if he would have told you to do something incredible, you would have done it.
Exactly.
So why won't you do something that's so simple? Like, this is the best case scenario here. But I think once again, it just shows how much selfishness and pride can consume you, where you act irrational. Like he won't even do the simple thing to heal him of this leprosy that had obviously been plaguing him because of his pride. And that's so important for us to evaluate ourselves. I know I've done some very silly and stupid things just because I'm too proud to admit something. And Naaman here is too proud to admit that all he needs to do is go wash in the Jordan 7 times, and even though it'll cure him of his leprosy. It's a good story to show how selfishness can create dumb reactions to things.
And I think absolutely right, that pride is one of those sneaky things. You really do not understand yourself being prideful until someone takes a video or you get something like this written about you, and it's like, that's really the way I acted in this situation. And I'm glad. Thanks for the compliment. That's why. That's the first thing the story I thought of when it comes to not being about you is a guy who's like, why didn't he make a bigger production of this? Why couldn't I go wash in some prettier rivers? Like, why is it? It had nothing to do about ultimately what was going to get rid of his leprosy. It was about the show, about me, and that.
It just
pretty embarrassing.
Yeah, it's embarrassing just because he's making, and this is another thing that I think we can learn from this. He's making a big deal about details that don't matter. He's like, "Oh, the water in this river is better than the Jordan." Why? Does that stop you from being healed?
You should have dipped in those rivers before.
I should have done that before. But like you said, he's wanting a production. But I think it also shows that this is the prophet of God that has asked him to do this, that has told him what he needs to do to be healed. And if that's what he could have asked them to do, anything, and that's their point. Don't try to fight with God. Don't try to fight with what he tells you to do. And that's another good lesson for us is we may not always agree with what the word tells us, or we may not always like what it tells us to do. It may not be what we think is right, but it is not up to us to fight with it. No. And obviously here, Naaman's way of thinking was not correct. No. And so maybe ours isn't either sometimes. And that's what I think, he finally comes to realize is that it doesn't matter what he wants. It matters what God had asked him to do.
Only in our pride can we think we can outsmart an omniscient, omnipresent God. It's absurd. But that's the story of Naaman is he goes, his servants, as Clay mentioned, his servants go and tell him like, hey, if he would have told you to do something incredible, you would have done it in a heartbeat. Why don't you just do this? So maybe reluctantly, but he goes and dips himself in there. And it says in the text, the way that mine's translated, that he has the flesh of a little child. It's a little baby. That's some beautiful skin there. So, as Elisha predicted and as Elisha said, his flesh is clean. So we have that story, and that's the story of Naaman's is cleansing, and that's pretty awesome, showing, especially because this is a Syrian, this is even an Israelite. There's a lot of cool aspects to this story, but we also see a little bit of Naaman's repentance in this next passage. In verse 15, it says, "Then he returned to the man of God, he and all his company, and stood before him and said, 'Behold, I know that there is no God in all the earth but in Israel. So now accept a present from your servant.'" And so basically, the man who was
kicking at the goads before is now like, there's no God but Yahweh. There's no God but the God of Israel. So he's very repentant. He says that he's going to worship Yahweh. He asks for a pardon when he goes and worships with his king. I assume at Rimmon. It's a very interesting little passage in there. But it's so radically different. And I think once we understand God's saving grace and we understand what God has done for us, that's going to be our reaction. Is like, wow, I didn't deserve this.
Yeah.
So I think that's Naaman's reaction. At least to me, from what I understand out of this passage, he seems very repentant. So
I like this story a lot because one, it shows what God can do for us if we listen to Him. But I think this point has been another interesting thing going back. Is this point has been made a lot of times in the Bible how they'll be building up to this battle or war or whatever, and then you get to the battle and it's like one verse. And I think in verse 14, when he finally decides to go wash in the Jordan, it's just one verse, and he did it and he was clean. Yeah. And just again, the simplicity of what God asks us to do. If you obey it, it's what happens. But then going into what you said about his repentance, once I think he finally realizes that when God can take away something as big as his leprosy, when that burden was finally lifted off of him, doing something that simple, he realized the power of God, and sure. How, like you said, he goes from fighting against him to saying, your God is the only God.
The only God.
But it just shows that if we put our trust in God, that he has the power to do anything through us.
For sure.
And so just a good lesson there.
Yeah, I really like that application of all this build up just for one thing, and it's all good. So I love that aspect. Unfortunately, the story of Naaman, Naaman's kind of story ends here a bit, but then we're introduced to Gehazi, and Gehazi is Elisha's servant, and I'm going to start reading in verse 20, and we see how he continues on this idea of selfishness. It says, Gehazi, the servant of Elisha, the man of God, said, "See, my master has spared this Naaman the Syrian, and in not accepting from his hand what he brought. As the Lord lives, I will run after him and get something from him." So Gehazi followed Naaman. And when Naaman saw someone running after him, he got down from the chariot to meet him and said, "Is all well?" And he said, "All is well. My master sent me to say, there have just now come to me from the hill country of Ephraim 2 young men of the sons of the prophets. Please give them a talent of silver and 2 changes of clothing." And Naaman said, "Be pleased to accept 2 talents. And he urged him and tied up 2 talents in silver bags and 2 bags with 2 changes of clothing, and laid them on 2 of his servants. And they carried them before Gehazi. And when he came to the hill, he took them from their hand and put them in the house. And he sent them away, and they departed. He went in and stood before his master, and Elisha said, "Where have you been, Gehazi?" And he said, "Your servant went nowhere." But he said to him, Did not my heart go when the man turned from his chariot to meet you? Was it a time to accept money and garments, olive orchards and vineyards, sheep and oxen, male servants and female servants? Therefore the leprosy of Naaman shall cling to you and your descendants forever." So he went out from his presence, a leper like snow. So, selfishness it goes in a lot of different directions. It could be your notoriety, your clout, as it was with Naaman, or it could be this love of money that Gehazi falls into. And that's something that I think American Christians in particular, that can be very dangerous for us. So I don't think I brought up this part when I was mentioning the little verses 15 through 19, but Elisha refuses the gift that Naaman brings. Again, I think a showing of his humility, understanding that this gift wasn't me who did this. It was God who did this. But Gehazi, seeing that he just turned away silver and some dope clothes, like what is your deal? Basically goes and chases after Naaman to go get something, makes up this story about these people coming, that Elisha now has changed his mind, that he actually wants some silver to give to some of these prophets. And it's sad to see, like Gehazi does, even being a servant of Elisha, doesn't understand the way that God works, the way that a prophet works, and is really driven by his greed, driven by what he can get out of this situation, and it's going to ultimately lead to some pretty bad stuff happening to him. You have any thoughts on
Yeah,
Gehazi?
I think we first need to realize like this was a serious temptation. We read the passage, and a lot of those things that Naaman brought aren't appealing to us. Yeah. But throw whatever amount of money you want in there, and like you said, like for us, this would be like designer clothing, like Gucci, whatever brand you want to throw in there. If somebody brought all that stuff, it would be tempting.
Yeah.
But I think the point here, and what I'm disappointed in for Gehazi is that, he has Elisha as his master, who has the power of God, who just healed this man of his leprosy. And I think Elisha's trying to show the point that physical things don't really matter. Mm-hmm. Like, I have the power to do whatever I want. God gives me the power to do whatever I want, and He can provide anything for us. But that's not what's important. Mm-hmm. And obviously, we see Gehazi, falls into that trap. But just once again, showing that physical things really aren't the end all be all. It's more important to have those spiritual blessings.
Yeah.
And, Elisha realizes that. And I think that's why he shows humility. Whereas Gehazi, is chasing after maybe this small fleeting amount of wealth. But to what end? What end does it get him? And I think another good lesson here about selfishness is that selfishness is not just a one-time or one consequence sin. Selfishness is not the only sin that comes out of this. Because when he goes and tracks down Naaman, he then lies, right?
Yeah.
He tells him, like, oh, these people came and we need those gifts now.
Yeah.
And so when you're selfish, it becomes a lot more of a temptation to do other sins, right? Put that in any situation. If you're selfish, then yeah, you could lie about something. Or I want to look cool in front of some people, so maybe I'll compromise some of my beliefs. It's just it leads to other sins, and we see that the consequences are a lot greater because of that selfishness than even he could have ever imagined.
Yeah, for sure. I think that those are really great points. And pride is one of those sins. One of the reasons it's so sneaky is because you think I'm trying to figure out a lying issue. I'm trying to figure out a lust issue or something else. And underneath that is pride. And it just kind of lurks under the surface. So it's very dangerous. And one of the things that pride also does is Gehazi just witnessed the power of God. That's something that was uncurable in Israel, in Syria, no matter what river you dipped in, it was uncurable. And then God cures it. And he witnesses the power of God and then desires the physical more. That is so dangerous, because when we desire the things that we can see and the things of this earth more, those are the things that don't matter. They are temporary. When you truly desire God, that is what's eternal. But that's what pride does. It blinds us to the incredible things God has revealed and incredible things that God does, and rather we get attached to the things of this earth. So it's dangerous for a multitude of reasons. And we see the consequence ultimately with Gehazi receiving leprosy, and that's just really difficult to handle. So I think it's a very interesting story, a really sad story for Gehazi for sure, but a reminder of what pride can do to us, the fools it can turn us into. So
and he just does a lot of foolish things here, and I think it shows you that Gehazi is supposed to be a man of God. Like he's Elisha's servant. And one moment of foolishness, one moment of pride changes his entire life. Yeah. I mean, he goes from, literally, when he woke up that morning, I'm sure he didn't expect Naaman to come, to at the end of this story, he's a leper. Yeah. And that shows that if we're not on guard, if we don't understand the importance of always, living as we should, something like this could happen to us. Obviously we may not become a leper, but you've seen instances where, someone has made one bad decision in their life, and now for the rest of their life they're remembered for that. And, you really have to be careful and accountable for all of your actions.
Yeah. So really good points there. So we're going to talk about the opposite pride when we come back, and we're going to go to Philippians chapter 2 and talk about the ultimate showing of humility. So we'll be right back. Okay, so we are back, and we're going to talk about the opposite of pride, the opposite of the selfishness that we've been talking about so far, of course. And I can't think of a better passage in the Bible than Philippians 2 to illustrate this point. So we're just going to go, if you want to read along, Clay's going to be reading the whole chapter for us. So.
All right, Philippians chapter 2. It starts, so if there's any encouragement in Christ, any comfort from love, any participation in the Spirit, any affection and sympathy, complete my joy by being of the same mind, having the same love, being in full accord and of one mind. Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. Let each of you look not only to his own interest, but also to the interest of others. Have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant. Being born in the likeness of men, and being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Therefore God has highly exalted him and bestowed on him the name that is above every name, so that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow, in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. Therefore, my beloved, as you have always obeyed, so now, not only as in my presence, but much more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who works in you, both to will and to work for his good pleasure. Do all things without grumbling or disputing, that you may be blameless and innocent children of God, without blemish in the midst of a crooked and twisted generation, among whom you shine as lights in the world, holding fast to the word of life, so that in the day of Christ I may be proud that I did not run in vain or labor in vain. Even if I am to be poured out as a drink offering upon the sacrificial offering of your faith, I am glad and rejoice with you all. Likewise, you also should be glad and rejoice with me. I hope in the Lord Jesus to send Timothy to you soon, so that I too may be cheered by news of you. For I have no one like him who will be genuinely concerned for your welfare. For they all seek their interest, not those of Jesus Christ. But you know Timothy's proven worth, how as a son with the Father he has served with me in the gospel. I hope therefore to send him just as soon as I see how it will go with me, and I trust in the Lord that shortly I myself will come also. I have thought it necessary to send to you Epaphroditus, my brother and fellow worker and fellow soldier, and your messenger and minister to my need. For he has been longing for you all, and has been distressed because you heard that he was ill. Indeed, he was ill, near to death. But God had mercy on him, and not only on him, but on me also, lest I should have sorrow upon sorrow. I am the more eager to send him, therefore, that you may rejoice at seeing him again, and that I may be less anxious. So receive him in the Lord with all joy, and honor such men, for he nearly died for the work of Christ, risking his life to complete what was lacking in your service to me.
All right. Thanks, Clay. So, Philippians 2, if you haven't read it for yourself, you should. Really, it's a very powerful passage. And I'm only going to cover a little bit. We're only going to talk about a little bit of this. Again, it's something that the more, especially the opening line when you reflect on Jesus and that, if it doesn't really drive you to be more humble that day, I don't know what will. But we're going to really be focusing in on these characters that Paul addresses here, and even some of the ways that he talks about himself, because that is the example of humility that I think is very practical for us. So he opens up by addressing the Philippians and telling them that, there's a couple of these things, that if you have received any, he says, any comfort from love, participation in spirit, encouragement in Christ, affection and sympathy, all these things, which default as a Christian, you are going to receive those things. So because you have these things, you are supposed to imitate Christ. And how would one imitate as Christ? But as Clay read for us, the emptying of oneself. That you don't look simply for your own interest. You aren't simply selfish with what you have, but rather you look to what other people need. What other people need, particularly in your congregations. But looking outside of that, there's people that you have the opportunity to serve their needs. So, and this is the mind that Jesus had. That he was in the form of God, but didn't count equality with God something to be grasped. But I love this word, emptied himself. That here is God himself, and he decides, I'm going to become man. I'm going to come to the earth and not become a king. I'm going to be a servant to all people. So all of us who were born not kings and just normal people, we have no right to be selfish. We have no right to think of ourselves as more important than other people, because the most important being in the earth, in the history of the ever, came down and decided to serve all of us. So really powerful opening passage to Philippians 2.
I agree. it just really makes you, like you said, consider yourself and realize how much we fail as being, selfless people. Because, I made the point earlier, it is natural to think about yourself because, obviously you have to take care of yourself. You have wants and needs. But then you see Jesus, here, who, like you said, emptied himself. That idea that instead of filling himself up with what he wanted, he literally gave all of himself, even to the point of death on a cross, for the entire world. And obviously we're not asked to do that as Christians. We're not asked to literally go, die on a cross for the world. But I think it is a good example of, maybe there is something to, looking out for other people, for thinking about other people's interests and not just our own. And like you said, he was God in the flesh. And yet we see at the end of his life, he's washing the apostles' feet. We see that he is constantly, whenever anyone wanted to be healed, whenever he can make time for someone, he's always doing that. And I think it's just a good lesson for us because I see it a lot and I'm guilty of it myself. Whenever I have a spare moment or whenever I get something, whether that be money, I always think, well, now I get to do this. Now when I'm alone, I get to do this. Instead of thinking, how can I use my abilities and what God has given me to help other people? How can I make somebody else's life better? Because if we're only ever looking out for ourselves, we're not helping anybody. We're not helping ourselves. We're not growing as a Christian, and we're definitely not helping other people. And so, like you said, Paul is a great writer. There's no doubt, but he does a great job here of explaining, how important it was for Jesus to have this selfless attitude, and really makes us understand why we should as well.
For sure. Yeah. So Clay brought up a nice point that connects it with last week when we talked about giving and using our free time, the opportunity, like that is a gift that God has given us, is time, so we can use that to be serving other people. But as Clay was also mentioning, like this idea of Paul being a really great writer, and he paints this incredible picture of Jesus. We can't forget this is the mind that we are supposed to have. The same mind that Jesus had. Of course, we're not going to be perfect, that is out of the question. But we need to be imitating him, how he served, how he's willing to serve even us. So it's a beautiful picture. And ultimately, at the end of the day, it's not that Jesus just goes to the grave, gets raised, and nothing really happens from that point. He is risen. He is exalted. And that same thing is going to happen. When you seek to fill up yourself and you want to make a name for yourself, the end of this life is going to mean nothing. Right. But if you choose to humble yourself and let God exalt you, that's the only way you'll truly be exalted. So,
no, I agree. And we all, what's funny here is Jesus didn't need to tell people how great he was. He could have been like, look at me, I can do all these miracles. And he did amaze people by what he did. But he never, ever, I don't think, came across as, look how great I am. Yeah. Look how, powerful I am. And we all know those people that they walk into a room and they have to be the center of attention, right? And we see how much we dislike that. We dislike people who are like attention grabbers. And we need to ask ourselves, well, am I like that? Am I trying to call attention to how great I am, whether that be anything you can do as a talent in life or spiritually? But instead, I think Paul makes a great point here that he hammers home that Jesus was a human. He came in human form and he chose to humble himself. Yep. It wasn't like he was just God, so it was easy for him to just say, all right, well, I'm going to die, I'm God. No, he was a human who goes through everything that we do, but yet he was able to make the choice to literally sacrifice his life for everyone. Yeah. And so, if he was able to do that as a man, then we can make small sacrifices, that are a lot less than that.
For sure. So Jesus is the ultimate picture of what it looks like to have this humility, to have power under control, something we cannot live up to, but something we should be constantly pursuing. And that's what, when you read Philippians 2, when we read Philippians 2, it should be an understanding that I'm not there yet. I'm going to keep pursuing and trying to get there. So as Paul continues, he talks about the way that the Philippians are supposed to be transformed a little bit more as he's already addressed. So he says that you guys need to continue to work on work out your own salvation, as he says in verse 12. And they're just supposed to do all these things, and says he comes back in 14, do things without grumbling or disputing. That's a symptom of selfishness, where you insist on your own way so much that you're going to fight over it. James talks about that over in his book as well. And he talks about being the separate people, a light in this generation. And then he says in verse 17 about himself, even I am to be poured out as a drink offering upon the sacrificial offering of your faith. I am glad and rejoice for you all. So I don't think Paul is trying to toot his own horn here. But this is truly Paul's attitude, is if I can serve you, I will pour out myself. I will empty myself like Jesus in order so that I can serve you. So another way that Philippians 2 illustrates this is through Paul and his willingness to do whatever possible, whatever he can to serve the Philippians. So
right. Yeah, I think, two big takeaways here is like you brought up verse 14, do all things without grumbling or disputing. We read that verse and a lot of times, I know I've just kind of read over it, but, that leaves nothing out. Mm-hmm. And like you said, a lot of times that's a symptom of selfishness. And, I will raise my hand and say I'm the chief among the grumblers and complainers, because a lot of times I don't want to do something, or it's, not the way I would have it done, and I complain and I grumble. And that doesn't benefit anybody. It doesn't benefit yourself, doesn't help the situation. And instead, why don't I just try to help in any way I can and be a light, as he talks about in the next couple of verses. Mm-hmm. But then you brought up Paul boasting. And, one of the things me and David were studying, we just finished 2 Corinthians when he's writing that letter to them. And he talks about, well, I don't really want to boast, but guess what? I'm going to boast. But even if I do, I'm going to boast in my suffering. And that's the idea that if you're going to boast in something, it's in Christ, yes. In how, his word affects you, and about how, yes, you may, Paul's boasting about here, I might have to be poured out as a drink offering for you, but that's okay. I'd rather suffer and be proud of that, and be willing to give my life, for something that matters. Yeah. And, a lot of times I think we don't want to boast in the hard things. We don't want to, it's not, and I think what he's trying to say is, to God, that stuff is glorious. That's what gets praise, is the little insignificant things that you do to help other people and to make other people's lives better. While in your eyes and in the world's eyes, those things aren't great. That's what he counts as, praise. That's what he's going to praise you for in the end. Mm-hmm. And so, Paul understood that.
Yeah, absolutely. I really like the way that you phrase that idea of like, so he's ready to be poured out, and it's not about him. And when I boast, it's not about me. Yeah. That sure, I've done things, like I've been put in these positions, but it's only that God's been working through me. So I think as far as I understand, like, there is plenty of ways, like, there is things that are sin and things that are not sin. And oftentimes what sin is, we take what God has given and we pervert it. Yeah. So there is a proper way to boast. And there's a way to boast in God. But when we start making about us and our accomplishments and all that we do, that's when it becomes a huge problem. So I really appreciate that thought. Anything out of that little section there?
No, nothing else out of that.
Yeah. So as we come into the last part, this was when I taught through this and when I preached through it, I always was like, what in the world was Paul getting at when he finishes this little thing? He kind of changes as he goes into chapter 3, which I know this isn't original, like he didn't have chapter numbers, but I was like, why does he include this little section about Timothy and Epaphroditus here? And the more I've studied, the more I've kind of realized this is another 2 examples of selfless sacrifice, of people who are not looking out for themselves. It's about how they can serve and how they can honor Jesus. So firstly, he talks about Timothy. And in verse 20, it really sums up the entirety of what Paul wants to get at here. For I have no one like him who will be genuinely concerned for your welfare. That Timothy cares. And he is willing to travel and go places and do whatever so that he can honor that. And I think Clay's kind of mentioned a couple of these things before, but if we are not willing to do that for our brethren, like, we got to get together. We got to get in shape, because we should be genuinely concerned for the souls of our brothers, but also maybe someone just needs some help mowing the lawn or something like that. We should be genuinely concerned for their welfare.
Yeah, no, I think this is because this is like stuff we can do, right? Jesus, we can't be like Jesus.
No.
And to some extent, we can't even be like Paul as far as, the relationship that he had with Christ being an apostle. But, we've talked about selfishness, and, it's funny because we know, we read this stuff, but yet we go out in the world, and what do we want? We want to be, rich and famous. We see that as the standard. We see, whether that be really athletic or having a certain skill or being able to do this thing very well. And instead, everything we see in the Bible that people get praised for, you think about Barnabas with being an encourager. Well, here, like you were saying, it's literally Timothy has genuine concern for your welfare. And Paul says, I have no one like him because of that. And so that really, humbles me. Is like, what can that be said about me? Can somebody say, well, there's nobody like him because he genuinely cares? And I don't know. I hope so. I hope people think that I do. But I think the point is that all these things that we think we take for granted that aren't that important, that caring for people is not that important. That's what Paul is putting the most emphasis on here. It's not that, Timothy has a lot of money, so he's going to be able to help you. He can dunk a basketball, so he's going to be able to help you. It's no, he cares about you, and because of that, he's going to show the love of Christ for you, and he's going to, teach you the gospel.
Yeah, and as you've been a traveling preacher, and I'm in the pulpit often, and the more I'm up there, the more I realize that my job is like the least significant in the church. It is the servants who really do things for the congregation. I merely I do basically nothing, I feel like, but it's just so important for us to realize that whoever's in the pulpit or doing whatever things that people can see is not the most important aspect of this. It's those who care and those who serve in that. And that also goes for Epaphroditus, who we don't really hear much about him other than this in the New Testament. But we do have this guy who gets sick to the point of death as he's trying to serve the Philippians. But God, it says in verse 27, that God had mercy on him and also on me, because Paul loves Epaphroditus. And so he's going to send Epaphroditus to the Philippians so he can check on them and take care of them as he almost did. So verse 29 and 30, he reiterates this. So receive him in the Lord with all joy and honor such men, for he nearly died for the work of Christ, risking his life to complete what was lacking in your service to me. He died serving you, or almost died serving you. So that I just love this picture that Paul, he paints this picture of Jesus. He talks about how we're supposed to act. And then he comes back and talks about these two characters who, if you read it out of context, it's like, what is this for? But when you read in the context, it's, look at these servant-hearted men. Look at their drivenness to care about you and to serve you to the point of even death. And I just love that aspect. And as you were mentioning, those are things that we can do. Right. Those are the people that we can try to be and try to emulate. So
right. And I think another important lesson from here, and that is dangerous, especially for young people, is that who are we making time for? It can be so easy, as I was talking about earlier, when we get free time to say, well, all right, what do I get to go do now? What cool thing do I get to go do now? And a lot of times we I don't know the word here, but we forsake, the chances we have to spend time with God's people, or to take care of God's people, to check up on them, to see what we can do for others. And we see here that Epaphroditus, who I don't think he's mentioned more except maybe even this one time, but all we know about him is that he was willing to die so that the work of Christ might, be completed. And, you wonder, what would his life have been like if not for that? He probably would have been, fearing for his life. Yeah. But that's what it takes. That selfless attitude, a lot of times, it may put us in some situations that are uncomfortable. I know I've done some things for some people that are not always the most fun. But when you see how thankful they are for you, or what they get out of it, how appreciative they are towards you, it makes it worth it, right?
For sure.
And I would say that Epaphroditus here, yes, Paul tells us that he almost died and he was, this is near to death, but he probably would say it was worth it. He was doing for sure the work for Christ. And at the end of the day, yes, it may not always be the easiest. We know it's a narrow road that we walk as Christians. But it's all worth it in the end. We went to, one of our members' funerals today, Brad, and they talked about how, he waited on the Lord. and especially near at the end of his life, it was not easy. He was struggling with Parkinson's disease. But he was a great example that even when life is not easy, that doesn't mean you just give up. That's what we were listening to at the end there with his sermon. That should actually push you to even more be selfless. To when life is hard, what can you do for other people?
Yeah, for sure. It all comes back to this heart of the message of what Jesus did. And from what Jesus did, we have people like Paul. And then we have people like Timothy. We have people like Epaphroditus. And Lord willing, it's also talking about you and your service that you give to other people. So, again, I think this is a really important topic. Clay's brought up a couple of times, like, in American culture, in American society, what people really want to be is celebrities. They want to be rich. They want to have power. They want to have clout. They want to do all these things. But what we learn through the gospel and through the message of Jesus is that the true greatest people are the ones who serve other people. And that means that we eliminate pride. That means we remember constantly that it is not about us, but rather it's about honoring Christ and honoring the people around us. So.
Right. And at the end of the day, it comes down to, I've always thought about it like this. Would you, when this life is over, would you rather your friends on this earth will say, well, he was a cool guy. You know, I loved hanging out with him. All my friends thought I was cool. Or would you rather God in the end tell you, you know, you did a good job. Enter into the joys, faithful servant. Your name is written in that book of life. And that's such a, you know, not an apples to apples comparison, but sometimes we sacrifice that.
Yeah.
We'd rather be what's in style with the world, or we'll compromise our beliefs and be selfish in order to, you know, satisfy what we want in the world. And in the end, that stuff doesn't matter. It doesn't matter at all, because when this life is over, the world is not going to even be a concern anymore. And so we need to really, like you talked about, time as a gift. You know, that's a great point, because what are we spending our time on? You know, in the end, I think we all have areas in our life where we realize we're probably wasting time, and we could do a lot better job of using it for the Lord, as the men we read about are. And to that point, you talked about how hopefully this is talking about us. When you read the Bible, a lot of times we think, oh, we're reading about characters who are almost like fairy tale type characters. But insert your own name into here. You know, this could be said about you. We celebrated Brad today. I think definitely some of this stuff could be said about him. And so a lot of times we read about these characters and don't think that we could be like them, but we can. And you know, God is almost, he expects us to as his people.
Yeah. So really good point about keeping our focus and our perspective on who do we want to recognize us? Who do we want to remember us? Just the people on this earth, or our God? Right. So, but yeah, thank you for coming on, Clay.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. And like I said, I'm glad that you're talking about things like this. And, you know, we're doing it in a very controlled setting here. Like we don't have necessarily a live audience that's critiquing us, but I think it's a good way of that you're putting this out in the world for people to see. And just for, you know, people who might be watching this, you know, we need to be able to talk about this with people too. Yes, yeah, like, I mean, I know your job as a preacher, you definitely do that all the time, but, you know, for people like me or who are not preachers, or at least full time, you need to be able to be comfortable discussing these issues with anyone. You know why? I mean, because selfishness is a topic that we talk about all the time. It may not be necessarily come up even in a religious conversation, but just having these, you know, very applicable conversations. Don't be afraid to talk about them.
Yeah, exactly. Just be honest with what we struggle with. So thank you again for coming on. Yeah. You have been watching the Pilgrim song. We're thankful that you tuned in. I'm sure Clay will be back in the fall, and we'll have him on for a couple more. So thankful that he was here, and hope that you'll tune in next week. See y'all.
See you guys.